Thank you very much. We are going to start with my co-presenter was unable to travel here, but he is going to make some introductory remarks. George Strawn. Are you ready, George, to make some remarks?
All set.
All right, so I'm going to let him introduce me, and then we'll follow from there. Go ahead, George.
Okay, hello everybody. As Cliff just said, I'm George Strawn. He and I were colleagues at NSF for more than 20 years, and we were also noontime running buddies to boot. I spent 10 years first in the SIES Directorate in various positions supporting IT research and cyber infrastructure. Then for almost another 10 years, I was NSF CIO, which in case you didn't know stands for Career is Over. We computerists strive to do two things, to do the right things and to do things right. While I was CIO, computer security became a big focal point for trying to do things right. At that time, I was responsible for NSF's internal IT security, which was a big enough problem. But of course, our primary focus was on its mission to support academic science and engineering research and education. And one of our premier activities was and remains supporting large scientific research facilities. Enter Dr. Clifford A. Jacobs. Cliff received his PhD in oceanography, but at NSF he moved up to the atmosphere and was in charge of our oversight of NCAR for almost 25 years. As cybersecurity became more troubling for everyone, Cliff sought me out and suggested the creation of this very sequence of meetings. I was happy to participate, especially given my pre-NSF job of running a university computation center, so I was aware of the opportunities and challenges. As can be said, the rest is history. And the continuing viability of these conferences demonstrates his foresightedness. Even ChatGPT knows about his contributions. As part of a much larger article covering his entire career, ChatGPT says, while Jacobs is more widely known for his work in geosciences, supercomputing, and cyber infrastructure, especially through EarthCube, he also engaged with cybersecurity issues, particularly as they intersect with large scientific facilities, data systems, and NSF's management of those. This suggests that his cybersecurity role was in policy, oversight, community coordination, and embedding security expectations into NSF's cyber infrastructure and large facility programs. I assure you, ChatGPT was not hallucinating when he said that, and now I give you Cliff Jacobs.
Thank you, George. Great introduction. I wanted to kind of go over how this whole summit started. And it's been 21 years going on. So many of you were not involved in some of the early things, as some were. So those are familiar faces that I'm happy to see in the audience. We have to start with a disclaimer. George and I do not work for the National Science Foundation now, so whatever memories or opinions we might express does not necessarily reflect those of the National Science Foundation. But I'm going to give you those opinions anyway. So what is the context for the Cybersecurity Summit? And let's start with the kind of an overview. The origins of the incident that actually was the impetus to start all of this, and then some of the obstacles NSF faced as well as the community. And I'm giving you a perspective from the National Science Foundation point of view rather than your point of view, which is kind of the implementers of the actual cybersecurity. Then how NSF decided to respond to this incident, and then some reflections that we're going to share with you on what we think you've accomplished, and then some conclusions. So we were unprepared. Staccato. You can look it up, Google it, and you'll find out that this was quite an incident. It happened starting in 2003 and then went for several years after that. A young man in the Scandinavian countries was very adept at breaking into facilities, and you can see that he broke into military facilities, NASA, several universities, as well as NCAR. That's why I got involved. And basically what we saw was this intrusion introduced kind of vulnerabilities in not only the data, but also in the network security. You have to remember back in 2003 or so that the internet was only a few years old, and we really didn't have a full understanding of what could go wrong. And this particular person was quite good at getting into these facilities. He was so good that he wound up in jail. But you can look that up in Google. So this is the situation. We were unprepared. It was a real wake-up call for us, and many places were compromised. If I have some recollection of that, there was some kind of flaw in the Sun software system that should have been patched, and he found it and got in, but this is a familiar story to many of you in that. So at the same time, NSF was involved in what we call large facilities, and they were particularly vulnerable, and we'll get to that. So NSF had realized that some of the major infrastructure it needed to advance science was very, very costly, and the grants program couldn't handle it. So they convinced Congress to start something called a Major Research Equipment and Construction Fund in 1995. So the physicists were there building LIGO and other kinds of major facilities and enhancing existing facilities, and also brand new facilities that could do things that were not possible before. And you could see at the bottom there the communities that were involved. Excuse me, the communities that were involved in those, and geosciences was one of them. And I have the picture of an airplane. That was one of my MREFC projects, and it's sitting down the road here about 20 minutes, and it's still flying now. It's at Gulfstream 5, particularly built to measure phenomena in the atmosphere at many, many different levels. So the challenges now that we have this situation, we have the MREFC, we have the staccato type of incidents. What were the contexts? Well, one of the things you have to realize that we have to deal with the context of the working for the government. So there's certain regulations and rules you have to follow. First thing, NSF is not allowed to conduct research. So we had no researchers that we could tell what to do. As opposed to something like NASA actually does research, NOAA does research. NSF does research through its agents. That is mostly university community. We fund people to advance the mission of the agency. NSF provides assistance awards, and that's a very important aspect that will go through this entire presentation. It doesn't mean that it's a contract. It is an assistance award. So the responsibility for cybersecurity is basically on the awardee. That is mostly the universities. So we have our hands are tied to some degree there. However, the large facility projects present a unique situation. They're funded through a different type of assistance award, and NSF actually be involved. So forgive me for going through some of the details, but it did set the stage for what we had to do. And they presented these particular challenges. Another thing is that since NSF awardees are on assistance awards, they're not subject to regulations like FISMA. We have to figure out how to meet this challenge to ensure the adequate and appropriate policies, procedures, and practices for the logical and physical security of non-FISMA environments. So that was an important challenge for us to figure out how are we going to do that. It was also Homeland Security had another thing, another policy that basically said you need to know who's in your who is using your facilities and be able to verify that. There are probably additional policies that are in place now within the federal context that are not listed here, but these were the two big ones that we're dealing with in around 2004. Another thing is the purview of within NSF, when we look at what's going on, we said the awardee has the responsibility, that is the universities. They need to know who's using their facilities, but we can't control that. And there are many international partners for these research grants, particularly for these large projects like the MREFC. So that's an additional challenge. So these large projects presented us with a particular challenge, and I'll give you one example. When NCAR was attacked, it had to shut down its supercomputer for a week to rebuild the entire operating system because they didn't know what was compromised. That means they're offline for a full week. NSF pays them to be productive. They're not productive. The costs don't go away. The costs are still there, but they're not being productive. So all of these large facilities have that same problem. If they, they spend millions of dollars building one of these facilities and then they're offline because they've been compromised, that's not good. That's not a very productive use of federal funds. So that was one of many impetuses that we talked about in terms of how we're going to deal with that. So how did NSF respond? You heard George talk a little bit about that. I came to him and he was the CIO, and we named this internal working group. We brought it together called FACSEC, which was the Large Facilities and Security Group. He was the chair, I was the co-chair of that group. And we started this idea of should this group do within the National Science Foundation. So we wanted to work with large facilities to help them create an IT security program, and we wanted to work with large facilities and other federal agencies to promote a series of workshops and an interchange of ideas about IT security and programs and practices among all the large facilities. We have to remember that there are other federal agencies like NIST who are quite well-versed in cybersecurity, and we needed to tap into them. The National Science Foundation was not there. So we recognized that the resources and the intellectual experience was there in these other agencies, and we needed to engage them. So the internal working group was all the science directorates who had basically was involved in some way or another in this cybersecurity program. And also we had some internal working groups, the Division of Information Systems, they were involved. That's the internal NSF cybersecurity folks, as well as the administrative departments, and we'll get to why we need the administrative departments in a minute or two. The Large Facility Office, which was created shortly after NSF started receiving funds for the large facilities, and then the General Counsel's Office to make sure that we were doing things correctly and within the law. So what were our goals? We wanted to start a conversation with the community. This is part of the conversation. It's 21 years into it, but we're having that conversation. We wanted to create a framework for cybersecurity responsibilities. This was not specified in any of the awards. We wanted to empower the community to actually start to take on these problems and tackle these issues. Then we wanted to support the community to organize itself and lead workshops such as this summit and other kinds of workshops. And we wanted to focus on large facilities, but we were hoping that there would be a trickle-down effect to other facilities and within the universities, that the intellectual thoughts and experience and practices from these kinds of people that are at this workshop, at the summit, would actually trickle down to other parts of the community. So NSF is a facilitator. This is the role that I think we can play as an agency, since we don't actually do any research ourselves. We tried, that FactSec was trying to get the dialogue going within NSF, and among that wider community, it was very, very important to us to get that. The facilitator role doesn't always work. And there are some great examples where it's successful. I consider NCAR a role in which NSF tried to facilitate the advancement of atmospheric sciences by funding NCAR, but they actually had to do it. Unidata was another example that was great and very successful. There's been some failures, for example, EarthCube. I was hoping it would be more successful than it would, but sometimes it doesn't work. In this particular case, NSF wanted to be a facilitator for cybersecurity. So we wanted to develop now, we need to develop a framework for the community, the large facilities and the larger community to respond to. So we tried to develop language and as an appendix to cooperative agreements for these large facilities and for FFRDCs. Okay, I just introduced a word you don't know. Federally funded research and development centers is what a FFRDC is. NCAR is an FFRDC. At the time, NSF funded 4, and they fund 3 now. The astronomy centers were 2 examples. DOE has the most FFRDCs. There's about 41 in the government, and if you want to, NSF actually keeps the ledger for that, so you can look on that. But essentially, one way to summarize what an FFRDC is they're kind of strategic partners to the agency. They accomplish something the agency wants to accomplish, but the history of how they are all created is a whole other different talk, and I'm not giving that today. So basically, one of the things we did when we wanted to shape this language, we actually got input from the community from some of the earliest summit meetings. They were responding to proposed language, so we were able to refine it. And we wanted to design this thing that guaranteed these facilities that would be able to basically tell them what to do to safeguard the research and educational activities, but in the absence of all of these federal regulations. So this was the framework we were trying to create. You basically have to do this as part of your award, but it's done with that language, not because you're part of you're receiving federal funds. Now, the first cybersecurity summit was done by NCAR in 2004 because they were immediately responding to the fact that they were penetrated and their data and security systems were compromised. We encouraged them to do that. We were still trying to put our act together. By the time we reached 2005, NSF had got their act together, and EDUCAUSE handled several of the early summits, and it quickly became obvious that it was not only a summit to start the dialogue, but we also engaged in the how-tos, which you see is still going on, where the workshops and how do you actually implement this language for your particular facility or for your enterprise that you are being funded from the National Science Foundation. So the terms and conditions could be interpreted a lot of different ways, so we wanted to start that dialogue. So we encouraged in these workshops and summit meetings how you would implement the language in the cooperative agreements. Now, I use the word cooperative agreements, and I'm going to take a moment to go. A cooperative agreement is a little different than a grant. Grants and cooperative agreements are still assistance awards, but cooperative agreements suggest that the agency will have a more substantial role in the oversight of that facility. So these big facilities were all funded under cooperative agreements. NCAR is funded under a cooperative agreement. Assistance awards, you basically give the PI the money, they can do what they want. If they're smart, they'll keep in touch with the agency. But the cooperative agreements had this particular bureaucratic leverage where we wanted to be involved. So we basically also tried to bring in all the expertise across the government in these workshops, and it was very successful. We encouraged that collaboration of information sharing among the facilities, and we certainly tried to describe what would the elements of a cybersecurity program look like. But many of the facilities did not really understand that. It was a brand new era where the internet was starting, the cybersecurity was something people knew about, but it was not something that they had dealt with as much as you have to deal with it now. So some of the initial workshops, this is all in the beginning, we had over 700 people that attended, and there's a bunch that are listed there. The LFO is the large facility office within NSF. And there was one, I can't remember the acronym for ORNL, but at this point, we had a number of these conferences. UCAR ran a measuring up where we tried to bring the community together, say, okay, how are we going to deal with this situation? How do you want to implement that? What are the best practices you're using in your community? So now I'm reflecting on what I think you have done as part of this 20 plus years that you've been active. You've certainly expanded the participation of stakeholders. You have a number of institutions participating. You have cybersecurity specialists coming to talk to other people in the summits, and you brought that expertise into the dialogue. You also created an intellectual commons about cybersecurity, and this is an example of the intellectual commons. So the Trusted CI has played an important role here. They were supported by NSF. They fostered an idea of maintaining a cohort and a community of practices that has endured today. And they supported also the idea of assessing your cybersecurity facilities that you have. Also, there's a range, the workshops and discussions deal with a whole bunch of other activities like the range of threats, which are constantly changing. Your defense technologies you might implement, which I'm sure has been discussed over the years, and also the response strategies. Just going back to that last point was when the Staccato incident happened, one of the things we found out was one facility didn't know who to call for the other ones because this guy was so good. He would delete people's email account, and they couldn't even communicate to each other to try to say, well, how are we going to deal with this? We know we're under attack. How are we going to deal to it? It was bad, okay? So the response strategy was one of the things they figured out, how to have lines of communication that would allow them to respond to an attack like this. So there was another part of this that we have observed, and clearly this is going on now, this idea of education, training, and awareness campaigns that have been going on. I can see the emails coming through, the kinds of presentations you have, and all sorts of facilities, shared experience. It's a great educational resource. Plus you have these workshops. I guess yesterday was one, and almost all the summits had some kind of workshop associated with them. And it allows not only the education, but allows the awareness of cybersecurity to become much more pervasive within the community. So I think it's been very successful. This is our perception of what's been going on, and we think, we hope it's accurate, but there's a lot of evidence to suggest it is. So what are the conclusions that I and George have reached over this period? The impact of the cybersecurity summits. These summits have fostered a national collaboration and a strategy for enhancing digital security at large facilities. But we think there has been significant trickle down as well for this, and the engagement of this. Everybody has to deal with this. It's a great forum for that. Also, the impact of the trusted CI, which was funded by NSF, and I'll take a moment to reflect. Ron Welch was the person back then was talking to NSF before the cybersecurity, before Staccato happened. He was making the point, he was visionary. He was saying, I think you need to do this. NSF was not on board, and finally it did get on board, and then it led to funding this trusted CI activity. And it was a paradigm I think was important, that we would have somebody in the community be the facilitator to help the community. That the trusted CI has been very resourceful and very productive. So it's an important idea of a facilitator for the community. You've achieved far more than George and I ever expected when we started this. The community leadership was essential. It's still going on. You have not disappointed. Thank you.